would like to thank Discourse very much for allowing me to try to take this opportunity to rethink a paper that I wrote nearly 20 years ago around gender and markets and educational leadership. The paper itself drew out of 3 studies at the time which were looking at principal leadership in Victorian schools in the period of the 1990s. It was a time in which there was radical neoliberal restructuring, although I called it liberal marketisation at the time, restructuring of the public education sector. And what emerged to me was the anger that the principals were feeling and the frustrations that they were having with the reforms that they were expected to carry out, and they were being directed to carry out. So the notion of emotional management, emotional labour, became quite apparent to me at this time. Theoretically, the paper, when I looked around in the education administration literature, I found very little that was talking about emotionality. There's a lot of stuff about principals having to manage stress, but not much on emotional management or emotions. So I looked outside to, first of all, the work of Ali Hochschild, who is very famous in her work on air hostesses and the emotional labour of being an air hostess. I looked into critical organisational theory, where again, some really interesting work by Stephen Feynman in an edited collection that looked at a whole range of aspects of emotion, how it was gendered, how it was racialised. And thirdly, I looked at the very recent emergence of feminist economic theory, where there was a very strong critique going on since the early 1990s around the so-called rationality of the market and the discussions around how markets are driven by greed, envy, fear and passion and desire as much as they are rationality. So what was emerging out of the data in these three schools, but across the whole sector really, was the ways in which policies of choice, which were being imposed from above by government onto public education systems. Now it's quite evident also to me, because I was not only a parent in one of these primary schools that I was investigating, I was also president of the school council. And it was quite obvious to me that there was not in Victoria or evident in the press or anywhere else that there was a big demand for parental choice. So it was largely being driven by a government push, and indeed the parent bodies were very much opposed to it and indeed took quite radical action, some of them going on strike, the teachers joining with the teachers to close down schools where there was standardised testing just being introduced. So to me, this whole idea of parental choice was very much an ideological push that was being imposed from above. And the principals who were involved in this group of schools that I was investigating, they were largely feminist women who had gone into teaching, then gone into become principals, with the hope that they could do something really quite different in their schools. They wanted to introduce more equitable types of practices, they wanted to address issues around gender equity, and so here they were now positioned in a quite different system than the one that they thought was most important to them and to their communities, and that was one driven by markets, where schools had to compete against each other and where they themselves had to compete with each other. And so a lot of the emotional work that they had to do was also had to dealing with their relationships with each other, because they found that when one school principal was pressured by her school council to take a much more market-oriented approach, she was breaking a type of agreement to be loyal to the other schools in the area and not to go down that marketisation, competitive track, and she became extremely upset about that. So these push for competition, for markets, was really undermining collegiality. It was radically changing the nature of the trust that existed between these communities and their principals, and between the principals themselves, and also with the teachers and the principals, because the teachers were being casualised, their jobs were being casualised to allow the schools to become more flexible. And so there were a number of divides occurring that was causing a lot of upset. So the point I'm trying to make here is that emotions, it is about the politics of emotions, and that emotions are not just individualised. Emotions are something that come out of a passion for something, the frustrations that these people felt, and the ways in which they responded to it. And that the job of the principal was was gendered in the sense that the role of the principal here was about caring for their teachers and for their students under systems of stress. So these studies in the paper, I was really drawing attention to two things. That first of all, that this was more than stress, that these emotional displays that they had to control, particularly because they were women, they couldn't show their rage, they couldn't show their anxiety, they couldn't show their frustration, because as women they would have been treated as incapable of leadership. But at the same time, they're expected to manage these communities, the anger of their teachers, the anger of the parents. So it was not, that was the first point, it was what they did as individuals, but it was not just an individual thing, because emotions are very much a collective thing. There's a relationality around emotions. And what emerged out of this is the strong collective opposition to these reforms, and in fact what emerged out of this later on, 2 or 3 years later in this community, was a social movement formed of parents, teachers, unionists, churchgoers, social welfare people that actually ended up voting out, together with the rural community, voting out this government in 1999. I've continued to be interested in emotions and watched the tracking of the literature on this, and I think what's interested me most is the way in which emotions have now been taken up within the mainstream literature of organisational leadership and management, but in a way that is really depoliticising it, and then that is treating it as gender and racially neutral, and that in a sense it is really dumbing down the significance of emotions in organisational reform. And I think it's most clear in, say, the notion of emotional intelligence now, which every school leader is expected to have, and how that's something that can be learnt, whereas, ironically, for feminists, if you were too emotional back in the 20th century, you were not capable of good leadership, because there was this very ridiculous binary between rationality and emotionality that was embedded in the leadership literature. So, to finish, I'm just interested about the ways in which this paper has continuing relevance and its resilience. It's been reproduced numerous times. When I reread it after 18 years, I was quite surprised, and I hope it continues to have, and I'm sure it will have relevance in the future.